So the main purpose of today is to get a Facebook conversation going based on the testimony recently given by whistleblower Frances Haugen. Apparently, there are some others that could be in the whistleblower pipeline for Facebook and possibly for other tech companies. And so the thing that we were concerned about was making sure that we grabbed the zeitgeist, so to speak, and made sure that students were talking about these things, because a lot of our students are actually working in different aspects of things that could end up affecting them someday in terms of their corporate careers or their tech careers or their marketing careers or however that works. This is not designed to make Facebook into a villain. It's not designed to make technology into a villain of any kind. The main purpose here is to consider recommendations and ideas for making technology and social media work better for us as human beings, as citizens, as students. And so that's our goal, not to say that these platforms need to be wiped off the face of the earth. The idea is more that what we want is to see that that they are following some ethical practices, which I've been reading. There are many that we can recommend. So this is not something that in any way is a question mark. There's all sorts of recommendations from very excellent people that can fix some of these issues in terms of the setup that Facebook has been presented and described as by Frances Haugen. So what I'll do is I will introduce myself. I am Susie Babka. I am a faculty of THRS, but I am also the Technology and Humanities Element Chair of the Humanities Center. And Dr. Clack and Dean Norton can correct me if I have the title wrong, but the idea here was to organize a forum for us to start the conversations going. The other thing that we were thinking is, because there's been a lot of interest in this, that we will probably try to do something more in person in the spring and continue these conversations going with various faculty members from different departments across the university. So our three speakers today all have very similar interests in what it means to think about Facebook and Instagram and other social media platforms as bodies that need some regulation and need some attention from our government and from us as citizens. Marissa Johnson will be the first to speak. She has her PhD from Columbia and her bachelor degree from USD, so she is an alum. Kristin Moran is also an alum of USD. So Marissa Johnson is currently the director of the Center for Civil Digital Society here at USD. She has a long list of amazing jobs that she's done. She was worked in user experience research in identity security and privacy at Google. She is an expert in privacy, in data protection, human-centered activity, usable security, data strategy, and research ethics. Kristin Moran is our associate dean in the college, and she is also a professor in the Department of Communication Studies. She has her PhD from the University of Washington, and her specialties are in Spanish language media, as well as attention to the role that media play in the identity development of children and adolescents, which is also very relevant to the testimony Frances Haugen gave. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Marilyn Johnson, who is recent faculty in the Department of Philosophy. And certainly if there's anything anyone wants to add when they're ready to speak. And she specializes in the philosophy of language, archaeology, and aesthetics, but she's also interested in AI, technology, and all of these issues, because come to find out, she's also got a marketing degree besides a PhD from the City University of New York. So with that, I will turn it over to Marissa. Or Dr. Johnson, sorry.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for the welcome. I think this is, the Facebook whistleblower allegations have given us a really, I think, presented us an interesting opportunity to talk about some interesting and pressing issues that we could all have a stronger voice in and begin to develop our opinions on. And I'd say that this is just, I think, one relatable drop in the bucket in terms of the things that we could be talking about in terms of proper use of data, data to serve society, our increasingly digital lives, and our roles as digital citizens. So for me, as was already mentioned, so we planned this series about Facebook and society in response to the allegations that have been documented by Frances Haugen. And she's a former Facebook employee. She worked there from 2018 to 2020, I believe. And it's interesting because while I was working at Facebook, she was working at Google. While I was working at Google, she was working at Facebook. So we don't know each other. We know a handful of the same people. And I bring that up because I think it is notable that she's worked at Google, she's worked at Pinterest, she's worked at Facebook. Frances has a lot of great experience at a variety of tech companies. So as we speak tonight, we're going to use Facebook to refer to a handful of entities. And so I want to take a minute to refer to kind of add a little bit of context to the different ways that we'll use Facebook to give us some space in the conversation. So when we say Facebook, sometimes we're going to mean a company whose primary business is advertising. Facebook makes all of their money through advertising. And that's sort of the big foundation by which that's the context that we should maintain while we think about it. We'll also use it to refer to a social network. So that is the Facebook that I think most of us conjure to mind when we hear Facebook. You think of it as a place that you log into, where you have a profile. It's a social network. That's where the company began. Mark Zuckerberg is always very eager to tell the story about how he was a freshman at Harvard in his dorm room, coding up this, innocent, simple idea of a sort of digital directory for students. Very nice. And, as a student, you could relate to the need for that. Since then, how long has it been? About 16, 17 years, Facebook as a social network now encompasses quite a lot of online services that we've come to know and love. So in that time, Facebook now covers through their marketplace, Craigslist-like functionality. They also have messaging, photo sharing through Instagram, also increasingly work communications and online interest groups. So Facebook has grown remarkably over the past couple of years. When we say Facebook, we are also going to use it as we refer to a small set of company leaders who have an immense amount of power and who have also been with the company for a very long time. So sometimes the most important of these people we will refer to will be the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. So he's created the company structure where he's in effect unaccountable to anybody, not even to his board, which is notable and something to keep in mind. We'll also talk about the COO, Sheryl Sandberg. So Sheryl Sandberg began her career in government. Her mentor is Larry Summers. She then went to work at Google. She's a renowned ads executive from Google. She then moved to Facebook, and she brought to Facebook a lot of the Google culture. She brought her government savviness from being a protege of Summers. And then she went to Facebook and built up an organization in addition to and alongside Zuckerberg's technical interests. Occasionally, we might also refer to key execs like Shep, the chief technology officer, Andrew Bosworth, who's increasingly in the news as Facebook is launching their initiative into metaverse. And also, you might also hear in the headlines the head of public policy, Joel Kaplan. So all of these are kind of key players at Facebook that are really core to making the decisions there. So the company went public in 2012, and they've made a series of game-changing acquisitions since then. So that includes acquiring Instagram. That was the photo sharing service. Also Atlas, which really beefed up their advertising capabilities. Anavo. This was an app that originally was used in developing countries for minimizing the amount of data you would use on your mobile phone. This meant by being like the broker of minimizing the data, they saw a lot of the traffic that was going across. And this is important with Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp, which was a huge price to pay for a messaging service. Facebook used their knowledge of Onavo to know how much WhatsApp was worth. So most of the world, we were gawking at, I can't believe Facebook is willing to pay, I want to say 4 billion for WhatsApp. It was a data-driven decision using Onavo's data. And then now Oculus. So you might have seen headlines recently about the metaverse and Facebook's interest in becoming the metaverse. Their claim is they want to move from being a social network into being known as a metaverse company. And this started with their acquisition of the headset company, Oculus. So it's virtual reality. They want to be now, our view into virtual reality, gaming, and more. So many of us are familiar with the consumer-facing identity of Facebook as a social networking service, and few of us are familiar with Facebook, the ads business. One of the things that I thought was really interesting from Frances's testimony is in her opening statement, she says, "During my time at Facebook, I came to realize a devastating truth. Almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside of Facebook." And I feel like immediately from that first line of her testimony, she had me just captivated because it is so true. For a company that is notably constantly pushing our boundaries on what we're willing to share, they are remarkably private about how they conduct their business and what their goals are. So from there, she continues to say, "The company intentionally hides vital information from the public, from the US government, and from governments around the world. The documents I've provided to Congress prove that Facebook has repeatedly misled the public about what its own research reveals about the safety of children, the efficacy of its artificial intelligence systems, and its role in spreading divisive and extreme messages." So she says, I came forward because I believe that every human being deserves the dignity of truth." And so I feel like that's just a really powerful opening statement. And then the rest of the testimony, which I highly recommend you watch if you haven't already, it carries on to document a couple of examples where Facebook's own internal researchers identified interesting questions to be researched in terms of what is the effect of Facebook's products on people out in the world. The one that we're seeing, I think, most heavily covered is the claim that Facebook's own research team uncovered evidence that Instagram and usage of Instagram has a negative impact on the mental health of teenage girls. That it increases the rates of depression, it increases rates of self-harm, it increases rates of suicide, all kinds of, not the sort of things that you would hope for any teenager in your life. Now, I'm actually not going to spend much more time talking about that specific result. And I'm not going to for one reason. It is if Facebook's researchers are the ones defining the constructs that they're measuring, and then going out and measuring these results, and then internally ignoring them, I just don't feel like we can trust them. So I think it's, from what I know about the company structure of Facebook. So actually in preparation for the panel, I went back and read The Hacker Way. So when the company went public in 2012, Mark Zuckerberg published a bit of a manifesto. So he wanted to let everybody know what sort of company they were to be investing in. And he wanted to make clear his stance on what his endeavor is. Reading this over this week has been super interesting because for a company that is utterly obsessed with growth and metrics and ensuring that they are always expanding to every market possible, attempting to capture the attention of every human on earth and kind of monopolize as much of your time and attention as possible and get you to share everything. Like they call all of those efforts growth, maximizing all of their own metrics. So for a company that is utterly obsessed and committed to growth, the people itself have shown almost no growth. So Mark's original statement about the hacker way and what they're after, it's still remarkably prescient. Like I'm not sure that he's actually grown as a human at all since writing this, which is kind of interesting because what was he? It was probably 2012. was like 27 when he wrote this. And I bring it up not to trash, him as a person or to trash the company, but as we're talking about it, I want you to think about if you could imagine a leader of something that basically a huge proportion of the globe is a member of and a part of, his, this individual's decisions affect so many people and is essentially unaccounted, not held to account for any of their decisions. If you think about the sort of person who you would like to have that much power, I'm going to guess you are not going to imagine Mark Zuckerberg or somebody who would write a manifesto like this. And so I was meaning to have this link ready so I could share it in the chat. But it really is just like a remarkable statement on kind of where they're after and where they're going. So it starts with saying Facebook's not originally created to be a company. It was built to accomplish a social mission, to make the world more open and connected. And then it kind of carries on from there. And as you're reading, it makes it very clear that, Facebook was built to empower the employees, not all the employees, specifically the engineers. So if you have the power to build, there's some language in here that makes it very clear that you are the most important people. And within the company, your wishes are the ones that should be supported. And so the company's response to Frances's testimony, which was basically to say, she's a nobody, she was only here for 2 years, she didn't even manage a team, she couldn't have possibly known these things. To me, like that response from the company was kind of just like a slap in the face, because they recruit people under the guise of, come here as a product person, you'll be empowered to move fast and break things. Everything about the internal infrastructure is designed such that people can do that as employees. And you're really trusted to go out and have agency as an employee to make the world more open and connected. So then for the public policy and the comms team to then come in and say, oh, she's not really one of us and she didn't really have, insight into all these things that she's claiming, I feel is just like a direct contradiction in terms of the internal culture that they're espousing in the hacker way and really that they've always been about. So I think in terms of kind of the testimony that we're seeing, I found it super interesting because I think a lot of what we're seeing is the result of the original hacker culture. I think that Frances's testimony could have shown off any number of really thorny issues, and we would have been, I think, shocked and dismayed by how poorly the company would handle it. And I hate to say it, but I think we're going to see more of it. I have a feeling that there's probably quite a lot more for us to see in the trove of documents that Frances meticulously collected before leaving. And I would also say that so her job title as a product manager is, I think she's really showing off the skill set of a product manager in the way that she did, in the way that she went about her whistleblowing. So she carefully planned it. She had a strong communication strategy. She was ready to answer questions when they came. I've heard a lot of people commending her for the way that she was very clear about what she did have knowledge of, and also clear on the limitations of what she knew and wouldn't overstretch in her answers. So yeah, I'm super curious what else we will see as the public. And then maybe I'll add just one more thing before I pass it on. I would say the one area that I strongly disagree with the testimony on, there's a quote in there that, Facebook knows how to fix it. They're just not doing it. I don't think they do. I don't think they know how to fix it. And I think even if they did, I wouldn't trust them to do it. I haven't seen evidence that we should trust them to do it. And I think that's the point where we really need to have strong conversations about government regulations that are not led by Facebook or industry, really. Let's see here. So Dr. Moran, I believe you're the next speaker.
I think so. Thank you so much for that explanation and kind of setting us up. I'm going to take sort of a broader perspective on what we think about media effects and the relationship that audiences have with media platforms more broadly. So I do want to provide a little bit of a perspective. So Facebook is 17 years old. It was actually born between my two children. And I think it shares a lot of commonalities with teenagers. It's unpredictable. It causes and expresses extreme emotions. It can make people jump to conclusions without evidence. And in general, I think it has a lot to learn about its place in society. And so I think that we really need to look at the discourses surrounding the introduction of Facebook in the same ways that discourses surround other types of technologies. So from a media studies perspective, this discourse on Facebook's effect on democracy and discourse, or even teenage well-being, mimics similar panic around early moviegoing, the introduction of television into the homes, and even the scary hard rock satanic lyrics that were worrisome in the 1980s. These moments of widespread adoption of new forms of communication have often been met with skepticism and public concern about their effect on the well-being of society. With the introduction of social media platforms, scholars now ask questions about privacy, disclosure, the difference between personal and public spaces. And in fact, how do we even understand these new mediated interpersonal technologies and their effects on families, relationships, friendships, and ultimately how we think about our connection to the broader society? There are some differences between Facebook and other social media platforms like YouTube that distribute user-generated content, and media corporations that buy and produce professional products through production distribution systems. Professionally produced media, whether it's news or entertainment content, is created through a set of processes, and it has gatekeepers that have been developed over time. Content that is created by individual users obviously does not undergo any sort of regular professional scrutiny. As a result, this type of communication asks us to ponder different questions, both in terms of media effects, but also of regulatory measures and responsibility. We now are asking questions about who's responsible for algorithms designed to track user experiences and preferences. These are intended to optimize viewer engagement. The question is, from Facebook, what do they want me to see? And that is different than what we kind of thought of the internet from its beginning. You know, in the early days, there was an assumption that the user had control and could actively curate their experience. Then came Google and other search engines that optimizes user experience by feeding content based on previous habits. But I think part of the response from the public to these Facebook allegations is because some people still think that they have power over what they see on the internet and are really just now coming to terms with all the behind the scenes manipulation. This also brings us to the economic model. How are Facebook and others making money? Remember the time when advertisers were reluctant to put their ads on the web because they didn't know if people would be paying attention? That's gone now. We know that advertising is the way in which Facebook is making money. So in some ways, this ability to reach consumers is a dream come true for social media corporations and others on the internet. That is, if your dream is making money. So now we know that engagement is measured and monetized and sold to sponsors. And what we have learned from Facebook insiders is that engagement tends to be amplified when the content is extreme. This then drives the creation of more extreme content. But this is not new. In media economics, eyeballs have always equaled advertising revenue. And the more people who are watching, the more you can charge. And in fact, we've had sensationalized content since yellow journalism and newspapers and commercialization and throughout the creation of this type of content. Again, it's just amplified perhaps a bit more in social media platforms. So in watching the media coverage about Facebook and the distribution of user-generated content more broadly, there seems to be a few issues evolving. One issue I see is the blurring of paid advertising content and user-generated content and the inability to distinguish the two. These are often seen in violation of Federal Trade Commission policies, other policies to protect children's privacy. And then secondly, the responsibility of the platform to regulate or to be held accountable for content, referring to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And then finally, another area of concern is traditional media effects. What is the relationship between exposure and potential negative effects or even positive effects? We see that Frances has identified some of these issues in her recent 60-minute interview and the testimony before for Congress. She makes a claim that Facebook erodes public trust and has increased polarization. Interestingly, I think this is partly a result of the combination of advertising and content. So in early media research about journalism, we actually find strong correlations between newspaper, subscription, attention to news, and increased community engagement and sense of self within the connection to your society and neighborhoods. However, we also know from research on political advertising that in fact, as advertising skews negative, the result can be apathy towards voting and disengagement. So now we're seeing a combination of these two things. We have information about current events and politics connected with hyper advertising that tends to skew negative. So it's not surprising that we see some disengagement as a result of this interaction. The contradiction, though, is that we also see that independent research and scholarship has seen a correlation with engagement in Facebook and increased voter turnout. So the effects are not unidirectional. And that's what makes this relationship with audiences and Facebook users so complicated. Another strong point made by Haugen's subsequent media coverage is the claim that of the negative effect of Instagram scrolling on teenage girls' self-esteem, body image, and even suicidal thoughts. So these claims are that Facebook knows this and continues to pursue an agenda that prioritizes profits over safety. Again, this conclusion might be oversimplified, and it also might leave out a lot of research that has indicated that teenage girls' exposure to Instagram can also be beneficial to them and can create community and have other types of effects than just the negative effects on depression. In fact, a report by Common Sense Media outlines that teenagers experiencing depression can find support and community through social media. And I don't want to minimize Instagram's kind of negative impact on girls' self-esteem, but again, media research tells us that this is not new. We have been studying teenagers plummeting self-esteem for many years, and it can be traced back to magazine use. We've seen it with the relationships with Photoshop models, a lot of different things that have happened over time. And again, it's kind of complicated. For me, one of the things that has been a little bit frustrating with the coverage is sort of the surprise and shock that everyone has that Facebook could be engaging in these activities. Because for me, I'm not surprised that Facebook, a privately owned corporation, has created algorithms to increase profits. Like, what else would they be doing? This is how the media industry operates. And to think that platforms that don't have regulatory measures to safeguard against profit gains over their primary motive are somehow going to serve the public just because they should, I think that's a little naive. So while I don't totally agree that everything that we've accused Facebook of is easy and uncomplicated, I do understand that there needs to be some sort of way to hold corporations accountable for how they interact with audiences and the content they offer. Because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, these platforms are not publishers and therefore are not responsible for the content in the same way a broadcast network would be responsible for the news they report. In fact, to quote Section 230, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. From the point of view of someone who's a strong advocate for free speech, but also suspicious of phrases like the marketplace of ideas, I do think that the market itself needs boundaries, because just like in other sectors, safeguards are needed so that consumers are not taken advantage of and so that the most vulnerable are protected. I'll leave it to the data scientists to describe how we make that happen. But if it is true that the 2018 algorithm that Facebook unveiled has increased disinformation or increased destructive speech, then to me, limiting the power of the algorithm is a recommendation I could support. One other place where there are loopholes that can be tightened is stating that the required minimum age for these sites are 13 and older. This is not an age where magically kids are able to engage with content in a thoughtful manner. but it is the age where regulation ends for kids' privacy and protection, and also advertising limits. In fact, on broadcast television, we've seen a trend where target audiences are being said to be 13 to 16-year-olds, when in fact the content clearly, if you watch it, is for a much younger audience, just so that they can get out of the advertising limits that the Children's Television Act provides. I think we need to acknowledge that the young people are primary users of these sites, and therefore we should make decisions with this reality in mind. So in conclusion, I'll emphasize that the media sector operates within a for-profit model with little incentive to do anything other than maximize opportunities for audience growth. In the United States, we've had very little precedence for regulatory power, especially as it's tied to free speech. But I do think we are in a new frontier where fewer and fewer human beings are making decisions about what users have access to, and this is where we need to catch up. We have seen public outcry related to media effects in the past, but I don't think that there are compelling arguments in the independent research to prove that all exposure to social media is bad. So what we have is an opportunity to learn how to control the data and the feed and ensure that it's the humans that are involved in understanding the complexity and imposing some limits to the innovations that technology is providing. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pass it off now to Marilyn Johnson.
All right, so my talk, I decided to call Selling Our Eyeballs, our value to companies. And I'll be focusing mostly on Google in this talk, although as I'll indicate in certain ways, these things I'll say about Google also apply to Facebook. So I'm a professor here at USD in philosophy, and Susie mentioned I also have, as an undergrad, I double majored in philosophy and marketing. So it's mostly the marketing perspective that will inform my talk today. So during my undergraduate degree, I did a couple marketing internships, learned a little bit about the realities of marketing. And then in grad school in philosophy, when I was doing my PhD, I got a sort of unique fellowship where it was my job to market my department and its faculty online through social media and through creating websites for the department and faculty members in my department. So there I saw some of the inner workings of Facebook and Google from the perspective of a marketer. So for instance, in that capacity, I created this Twitter account for the CUNY philosophy graduate program. And today it has 4,000 followers, and not so bad just for one program at a school. So I did a lot of things in the interim to get all of those followers. So I just wanted to start off by highlighting the fact that advertisers are targeting us all. I was, targeting even people who'd be applying to graduate programs. That was my target market. And I wanted to, if you guys can, let's see if I can see a few of you. I just wanted to, if you could hit the reaction button, just anything, any reaction, if it will let you. If you've opened social media today. Okay, if you've checked your Gmail today and your at sandiego.edu uses Gmail. Okay, lots of thumbs. Use Google Docs or Google Slides. Obviously, I'm using that right now. Okay. Seen an ad. Clicked on an ad and bought something online. And then lastly, use a map service such as Google Maps. Okay, I saw lots of hands, as I expected to. And then I was curious if you guys would be willing, if you could share in the chat, if any ad that you remember seeing today, or if anybody purchased something online today, could you share in the chat what that was? And I'll just take a look there. Okay, all right, somebody got an ad for Target, somebody else, Grammarly ad, Instacart, Uber credit ad. Okay, and those all would have been targeted to you. Did anybody purchase anything today? Engraved watch band for Apple Watch. So maybe they know you already have an Apple Watch. Cryptocurrency. Dean Norton's been working too hard to see any ads today. And then Susie bought a book on Amazon. Okay, thank you. So we can all reflect on all the Google products that we use today so far. As I've mentioned, Gmail, for work, we all use that. All of us who are employees of University of San Diego, Google Slides, I'm using that now, and then Google Maps. Just think about all the effort that Google has to put in to maintain servers, to create accurate maps. Maybe you've seen those Google trucks driving around, giving us those Google Street View pictures, and that's a huge amount of expenditure of resources on the part of these companies. So this might make us wonder, it should make us wonder, why would they give all of this to us for free? And of course, it's not actually free. We are the product that Google and Facebook sell to advertisers. By using their products, we are transforming ourselves, our behaviors, into something that these companies can sell to others. So again, this is true both of Google, which I'll focus on now, and Facebook as well. So let me take a second to look back at the history of how did we get here? How did our behaviors become something that could be sold? And in this history, I'll draw on this book by Dr. Carissa Veliz, who's at Oxford University. She also gave a presentation at the Humanities Center last year that was coordinated by Hannah Holtzman. She also went to CUNY Philosophy, so I know her from that. So as she details in her book, Google began in 1995, Larry Page and Sergey Brin were at Stanford University, and it started with just sorting internet searches. Things that would be the most relevant would be highest at the top. And at the beginning, they didn't have a business model. They were doing something that was useful for consumers, but they weren't making any money. She writes they tried to sell it in 1999 and couldn't. But the value of Google has gone up significantly since 1999. In 2000, it was worth 19 million, 2001, 86 million, 2002, 440 million, and then 2019, 135 billion. So what changed to make Google so profitable? And it was that they started selling our information to advertisers using something called Google AdWords. With Google AdWords, ads could now be targeted to consumers based on what they search for. So think of how closely what you've searched for on Google mirrors what you're thinking about, right? And just imagine, what if everything that you Googled this morning was shared on the Zoom call right now, right? Maybe you Googled some medical information, maybe some, who knows? But you could, if you went and looked at your search history from this morning, you could get a pretty good record of the sorts of things that had been on your mind. So another Google product is Google Analytics. This builds on Google AdWords to track not only which ads were clicked on, which is what AdWords started with, but then it also follows the other consumer behaviors. So once you click on an ad, what do you do next? And when you're using Google Analytics, which I used when I was a social media fellow, you could then program in certain behaviors that you wanted to track once they get to your website. And these are called conversions. You can set anything you want as a conversion, and then within Google Analytics, it gives you a sort of a flow chart and shows you where users went within the websites and if they went to, if they converted. So for us, that was clicking on like the application to grad school. If you're an online, you're selling a product, that would be buying something. And then they give you what's called a conversion rate. So you can see of the ads that you're posting, which ones are leading to this behavior that you want to target. It also can help you learn how you should restructure your website. So from the perspective of an advertiser, the more information they have on you, the better. And that means that Google can charge more for your eyeballs. Your eyeballs then can lead to more conversions, basically, more money. And because I set up Google Analytics back in grad school, I haven't used it lately, but I'm still, of course, Google knows where I am better than anybody else, and they're still giving me ads for Google Analytics. So I thought you might like to see, when they market their product to advertisers, how do they spin it in those contexts? We've been looking at, like how Facebook would try to market itself when it's in trouble speaking in front of Congress. That's different from how they'd speak to advertisers, right? So this is an ad that I got just this week about trying to get me back on Google Analytics. It says that they've continued to invest in new, more intelligent Google Analytics 4 to help you get better return on investment from your marketing now and for the long term. So it says that it's easier to discover actionable, privacy-safe insights from across the consumer journey. It says it provides understanding of your full customer from acquisition by bringing together data across app and web. It works with, so you can learn about your customers even with gaps in data. It builds with machine learning at its core to automatically uncover insights from your data that help you protect and reach the customers who are most likely to convert. And with new data-driven attribution, you can understand the value of each adverse. So here they're highlighting all the information that advertisers can get. Notice here they say it works even if they're not using cookies, that it brings together data across app and web. So the story of, as Valise says, the transformation of data exhaust, something that used to not have value, into data gold. So we can take a step back, like philosophers like to do, and think about what are the aims of businesses. The aim of any company is to make money. And by selling our data, Google has made a lot of money. From their perspective, that's framed as increasing shareholder value. And we can see here how the value of Google has gone up over time. But of course, Facebook and Google are not the only companies that profit at the expense of individuals. This is found across industries. We can think of other cases of soda industry, cigarettes, and fracking. Here's a recent article from the New York Times about how drilling is making Oklahoma as quake-prone as California. So, viewing this in the broader context, we can then ask these other questions. What ethical obligations do companies have to consumers? What should the role of government be in allowing companies? And then as individual consumers, I think there are a few things we should keep in mind. Businesses exist to make money, not to help us. And anytime something looks free, we should be suspicious. That is likely means the creator of that product is selling our information and that we are eyeballs and potential dollars to them. Okay, so thank you. If you want, I would highly recommend Dr. Valise's book. And if you want to participate in social media, you can follow me on Twitter. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting about what you all were talking about was sort of the way that Facebook has become a corporation that is more or less like a government operating a country. And in fact, reading something from Tressie McMillan Cottom in the New York Times, she writes that his favorite saying is that he prefers companies over countries. And indeed, Dr. Holtzman and I were just talking about this in examining Blade Runner in our AI class, because Blade Runner is a dystopia in which only 3 companies run the world. It's no longer governments. And it seems to me that this is where the rubber hits the road when we're dealing with the question of how big companies are allowed to get. Indeed, Cotton even mentioned something about how we're dealing with a too big to fail problem. And I think that Dr. Johnson and both Dr. Johnsons talked about this as a problem of What is the overreach of business? And how do we do something about that? And Dr. Moran was saying that what we really need to do too is think about what it means to deal with the intrusions that Facebook and other social media platforms have on our young people, our children, what privacy means. Privacy is obviously an important issue for governments, for being a citizen, but we don't seem to have those same interests when we're on social media. And so I was wondering if anyone was interested in saying anything to that, the more political type question, I suppose.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Definitely. There's two parts, right? The first part of the question goes back to the idea that I think Dr. Moran talked about the marketplace of ideas, right? And I think that it's wise to think that that's a risky, idea to take part in, just because the marketplace of ideas is not necessarily an equitable place to be in. Anybody can say anything, and it's hard for the individual to vet. I'm sorry for the noise. To vet against things that are inaccurate and unprovable, right, or undisprovable, right? I'm sorry for the noise. Yeah, I'm outside. But the question I have is that as our lives become more and more digital, right, the amount of our opportunity that presents itself online and in digital setting, it grows exponentially. So previously, if you were doing something that was not complying with laws or regulations, it was the government who iced you out of participation, right? But now, in fact, it is corporations who can ice you out of participating in economics, in social media, in whatever it be. And as we trend more towards just increasingly digital environment, the amount of power that the individual or that the corporation has cross country, cross continent, will only continue to expand. And so it then comes to say who actually owns the citizen? Is it the company or is it the country? You know what I'm saying, because it is a matter of ownership, right? And then can a country actually effectively regulate against such a huge behemoth of a company in meaningful ways? Because that company can then say that you can't engage in commerce, you can't engage in this, you can't engage in that, because you need access to Facebook to pay your electric bill or something like that. And so it's interesting to see the expansion of these ideas. And I wonder what you think. Remedies or potential, ideas for combating that are. And I have a few of my own ideas, but I'm curious to what other people think.
So my favorite way to capture Facebook is to call their services slippery by design. And I feel like all of these things have kind of caught us flat-footed, and it is constantly expanding in ways that we're not expecting. And before we know it, things have taken over. And so I would say, for myself, I don't use any of Facebook services. I know for a fact that they have a ton of data on me. It's outside of my control. I have 2 young kids, and I am constantly disappointed by the number of institutions and organizations that have chosen to basically use a Facebook page instead of a website. And so, for example, my sports club, they maintain a members page on Facebook, and I've had it on my to-do list for a very long time to go and complain about that. And actually the whistleblower testimony gives me a good reason to finally act on it. But I already know that, the local schools, they use a Facebook page for sharing snow closures. So I'm still in Virginia, for weather closures, for updating parents. And to me, I feel like it's a real problem. We should not have our civic institutions should not be using Facebook, given their record, absolutely not. But I feel like that's a real problem. And then I would also say that, I've seen, so I was a technical person on the public policy team, and I watched the way that content policy decisions were made. And whether or not we agree with the outcomes of the decisions, I think that I think it is reasonable that we all crave more insight into who's making the decisions and what are the principles and how do we know. Essentially, Facebook isn't completely illegible to an outsider. So how could we even form an opinion on it? We don't even know what questions to ask. It's all of the functioning of it, the structure of it, the decision making, what's going on this year as opposed to the past, 16. We just don't know. And I think that's something that we could have higher expectations of. For the companies that are collecting so much of our data and controlling so many decisions, we could have higher expectations of the amount of transparency they're offering on their own operations.
And I would also just comment on like the public relations campaign that Facebook has been engaged in terms of claiming transparency, or at least having this advisory board or these other things where they're trying to make it seem like they're sharing information, but again, kind of pointing to the whole like very suspicious and more information coming out that even what we thought about what they were doing in terms of this like a cookie policy now where you have to accept the cookies. But then we see from Marilynn's point, like you can get around even people not accepting the cookies and still getting your data collected. And so, yeah, more transparency and in my opinion, we need some more investigative journalism going on.
I would also add that, as an individual, you can look out for opportunities to say no and opt out, especially when you're being offered a service that's free. So my sister actually texted me a couple days ago about a COVID tracking. I can't remember what service it was, but something that asked if she wanted to opt in to be notified if she was potentially exposed to COVID. Anytime you give permission or consent to something like that, you always should wonder, are they, why did they spend the money to give me this product? And what's their ROI, the return on investment for them to give me this free service? What information am I then giving to them that they'll probably go and sell to somebody else?
Surya Tangatur, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering about, hi, I'm sorry, I work in tech. So I just have a curious question. So I understand, I get the point of view of Facebook harvesting the data, Google harvesting the data, and a bunch of stuff, right? So half of the data probably is voluntarily submitted to all these services, like every page you like, every this thing, all of that data, you accepted to submit to it, right? So what is the role of law or the policy or the lawyers in enabling all of this? Because at some point, Facebook is not a utility. Facebook has no responsibility to do anything good for you, and you accepted to it or consented to it, right? So the main question is it even Facebook's responsibility, or is it the framework which is enabling it through law, through multiple layers of capitalism, which is enabling products like this to exist to begin with, right? So what is...
I'm going to say, I think it's both. I think that we need improvements to both. I think we have thus far settled for a very weak notion of consent in terms of data collection, use, storage, and deletion. We have very low expectations about how much information about that we have access to. I'll also say that if you pay attention to any public statements that Facebook makes about privacy, they're very careful to only say that you have control over data that you've shared. You don't, which means that Facebook as an advertising company doesn't actually give you any control as an end user for information that is accumulated and then added to the system on your behalf. So if you've ever used a customer loyalty card at a drugstore like CVS or your local grocery store, most of those programs track the purchases that you make and then combine it with Facebook data to identify which ads you've seen, to see if, have you seen an ad for Tide laundry detergent? And does that make you buy it over the next couple of weeks? So I would say that is, and then within our consent framework, both CVS or your local grocery store have your consent because you participate in the program, and Facebook has your consent because you sign up to Facebook to do these things. And I don't think that that's a thing that most people are aware of.
And I would also say that the individual responsibility on the consumer might be overwhelming, right? Because, right, given how we engage in our behaviors, because we're not maybe intentionally giving consent or acknowledging that we have given consent to when we sign up for these programs. I think it's also incumbent on Facebook and others to not make it so hard for us to opt out, or, you know, I just don't think it's necessarily only the individual's responsibility, that the corporations need to take some responsibility as well.
Yeah, and we also have to think about what it means to give consent in situations of coercion. You know, I mentioned soda and cigarettes. You know, that it's not an accident that we get addicted to these things, and you know, it literally is addiction that we, just in the same way that we get addicted to cigarettes. And then, you know, can we really even truly give consent under those types of circumstances?
I understand that. I'm sorry. I don't know if someone else has a question. If not, I want to continue.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So I understand the loose interpretation of consent, or where the companies are not motivated enough to do more to do this, right? Or basically educating the users or making it private by default. Like Facebook can choose to make all the shares private by default or only your friend circle, but they make it to global because they want search indexes or anybody to harvest that data and be able to index it, right? So, and from a shareholder point of view, I have more incentive to invest in Facebook and I'm making money. Most of the people are only worried about the profits they generate. A lot of people are, what do you say? They choose to be blind of all the things the company is doing as long as the company is generating profits, right? So I feel at this point, the government should force, like they did with, say, the Standard Oil, like they did with multiple other industries over time, to regulate them, avoid consolidation, so that the public is protected. And on top of it, make the laws which will force these companies to invest in these particular dimensions, right? And given the political structure, these are the companies probably funding every senator. So how do you break this gridlock? How much ever you have generalism, how much ever you have investigations, it's just, blowing trumpet in front of a deaf ears, because everyone has their own vested interest. What is the possible structure which can enable to break this cycle?
Right. I think it's a really great question. And at least from the state of California, so the state of California has a new, okay, I'm blanking on how what the acronym stands for. I want to say CCPA. It's basically a privacy commission for the state of California to look out for the data rights of the citizens. And over the past, I would say 10-ish years, California has really been out front and center on pushing digital rights for their citizens in a way that the federal government hasn't really gotten it together to do. So I'll be curious over the next couple of years to see what sort of effect that might have. So I recently saw, Ashkan Sultani is the director of the new, the new institution that will be looking out for citizens' rights. And he used to be a chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. And so he has kind of a good eye for these issues. And even like one of the core tenets has been that you as a user of a service have the right to request a data file to see, what data does a company have about you, what's available. And that could be hugely telling about in terms of what are they doing with it. So I was complaining earlier about how these systems aren't legible. As an outsider, we have no idea kind of really what's going on. And investigative journalists have been doing a lot, but sometimes it's hard to even find like kind of the thread to pull on to unravel. So these data requests are one tool that could teach us more. So there might be more coming. Yes, I want to be optimistic and believe that we might have more federal regulations on data use and data protection, but I'm not sure when it might come.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I think that it seems to be sort of a shared interest of people to have more regulation on companies like this. But when you see Congress interviewing people who are testifying, they don't know what they're talking about. The Congress people don't seem to understand how much of this works. And I think that Zuckerberg has been able to operate under the radar, that they don't really know what we're doing. So it's, we can just say what we want to say about what we're doing. And so it really is about how, it's about how to get more information out there to people about what's going on, about how people are being manipulated by the use of data and by the use of advertising and these sorts of things, and then figure out if there are ways that we can demand better algorithms, that instead of the algorithms that are most, more about engagement-based rankings, to deal more with, other pathways or something, that it doesn't have to be based on how many likes end up getting how many eyeballs and all those sorts of things. And so this has to be something that we continue to press these companies about and get them to admit this, because the government doesn't seem to really understand the depth of this yet. Any thoughts? Aziz Mukaddam, did you have a question?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Sorry, yeah, sorry,
It's
I was
okay.
muting myself, and there was okay. I actually asked the question to myself. I was muted. So yeah, so a simple but hard question. What do we do then as educators? So I teach strategic communication, and I exactly teach students how to look into insights and analytics, and to link purchases to and exposure to advertising or impressions. So since that is the reality, and students are more likely going to work in like industry that's going to use these tools, right? What do we do as educators in computer sciences, in communication, in philosophy, in psychology, sociology? Like, how do we communicate that like risk benefit equilibrium, and also the practical skills that they need to know in order to function in the job market?
I would love to hear Maritza's comment on that, since she's the one who's been working in the industry.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm currently developing a course on AI ethics for USD's online master's program. And one of the things that I have seen as an underdeveloped skill with folks that I worked in an industry is asking why when you're thinking about what you're doing. So a lot of the things that I didn't say come up when I was in product meetings, or just asking for the sake of what. So early on in my remarks, I talked about how Facebook is just single-mindedly obsessed with growth. It is growth at all costs. It is every person on Facebook for as long as possible, posting every bit of information possible. I feel like you have to really stop and ask yourself, why? Like, what does that get you? Like, why? And it's like, when you're in that sort of system, it makes sense because you have this mission of make the world more open and connected. And even those words don't really make sense. Like, make the world more open and connected. What does that mean? To what end? Like, what are we going to do when we're all open and connected? Right. And it's easy to say that with a little bit of snark now, but when you're in the company and so I grew up in San Diego, and my very first time on campus at Facebook, I remember I walked in and was like, feels like downtown Disney here. And like everything is perfectly designed. So you feel like you call it campus and these are your friends and these are your people. And, you know, you're making the world more open and connected with your 2,000 closest friends. And it's a weird vibe. And so I feel like the thing that I think the thing that we as educators could equip our students with is to help them identify their core values and then think for themselves on how do you express those. And just the fact that a tool exists that somebody else has built to do a thing doesn't necessarily mean that that is what you should be using or what you should be doing. And it's always appropriate to be asking critical questions. And I think giving our students the vocabulary and practice with asking these questions is hugely important. And I feel like it sounds like such a simple thing in response to your simple question, but it makes a big difference. Just stop and ask why.
Yeah, I think, so from my perspective, as an undergrad marketing major, I went to the University of Wisconsin. I had to take philosophy to fulfill one of my ethics requirements. And then I ended up, obviously, that's what I'm doing now. So I think, USD is a liberal arts institution. So there's, it's such a great place to try to connect up stuff happening in the business school with other things like the philosophy requirement that we do have. And people who are teaching marketing can highlight those ethical issues as they come up. Like I remember we would have people from industry come in. I think we had somebody from Schick come, the razor company, and they were talking about how can we get women to buy new razors more often when they shave their legs, the planned obsolescence sort of thing. Like, so if they put the little strip of like the shaving cream on there, then the user will see when that's gone, and then they'll know, oh, I need to go buy another razor, when actually the razor totally worked fine. So, if you have people from industry come in and they say things like that sound a little shady, it's profits over people, then, maybe you can let the students ask them those questions or raise those after that presentation. Because, we don't want our students to enter the business world naive and then get crushed by the reality of those companies either.
I'm not sure who is next. Can we get a question from Professor Brinson?
Yes, thank you. So I was kind of more going to respond to the question from Aziz about how do we teach our students. And in my experience in teaching Introduction to Media Studies, it didn't really occur to me to do too much of this in my class until I started teaching it as a living learning community. And the theme was, civic engagement. And so as I go through the process of media studies as a civic engagement professor and at this change-making campus that, that USD claims to be, we do a lot of that with every section. So when we're studying advertising, we look at the easy way out. It's easy to sell with sex. It's easy to sell with photoshopped bodies, right? But how do our students, rise above that and be more creative and more unique and find better ways to build businesses and sell products or make music or solve problems on social media. So, really making them critically think through these things as Marissa suggested. And so really focusing not just on not just on the digital age and social media, but all media. And because there is an easy way out and to make more money, and that is to sell more razors, no matter what, no matter what the reason is. And I think it's true. Why does every company have to be the biggest company in the world? And so I think really taking those two things together and having the students really critically analyze that is important. Of course, we want them to be equipped in the job market, but we also want them to be equipped in better ways than other people on the job market, equipped in ways where they'll actually question their bosses and some of the normal ideas that the like I said, the easy way out to make money and be more creative.
Thanks for that. I think that's a terrific point, that this is why we want to have these conversations at USD. So we have just a couple minutes. Io, would you want the last word?
Sure. I hope not. But okay, so I want to say this, right? I'm in my last few months at USD, so I'm like, I've taken all the ask the questions, be a questioning person, but I was really kind of a questioning person. And so like this problem is like something that continue to happen. It's like money is the bottom line all the time, every single time, and especially when you're talking about a company whose job it is or whose business model is about accumulating data, right? That's like in economics, that's like catering to the long tail. You can get data from anybody and sell to whoever wants it, right? That's the power of the internet, right? So, then you get into the theory of the firm. You get together just so that you can mass all the data and like price out all your competitors. So you become this like pillar of like, we have all the information you want. And then the only way you stay competitive is to get more and more and more and more, integrate more and more, right? So you start as a data broker and then you branch into like just like this omnipotent like omniscient like body, and so I think that centralization is the primary issue because they have access to every market and they have access to every individual in the market, right? So I'm curious to see like what everyone thinks about like decentralized systems as a way to combat centralization and things like that, because I think that when you have a decentralized system, it's easier for you to align the incentives of the individual with the incentives of the protocol or whatever it was designed to do. This way you can have individuals like, I use Facebook because I like to get connected with my friends, but also I know that Facebook can help me in a myriad of other ways, and that I can help Facebook in some meaningful way, right? So you can benefit from these servers, these systems, this broad database, but also you're not being exploited. You're actually having some sort of relationship with it. It's not just taking from you. So I'm curious about like what everyone's thoughts are, if you've ever considered those things, and what your ideas are.
Well, just a quick thought on centralization versus decentralization. I mean, it was the 1990s where we started seeing media corporations become conglomerates, and we do know that's reduced the diversity of information that we have access to. And so I agree that I think that some sort of corrective action that would decrease the vertical integration of these corporations might be one step into diversifying the content, at least.
I do think that part of where we go in the future, I hope decentralization has a big part. I would say as a technologist who, like, I guess I kind of like believed in the dream of the internet of the early 90s, and then like recently reread Tim Berners-Lee's book, Weaving the Web. It's just there was so much excitement and promise about what could have been done with the internet. And then you look at what we have today, and actually for all of computing, it's like we have absurdly overpowered laptops. We have so much connection. We have unlimited data everywhere. We have these little devices that we could put anywhere and all the storage we could dream of. And then we're all locked into Facebook, Google, Slack, Zoom, and I don't know, a handful of Amazon. It's just so disappointing. And then part of what, I'm kind of excited for this new administration to see how far they go with the anti-monopoly work that they're taking on, because I feel like it's a huge part. So like in my opening remarks, when I talk about Facebook acquiring Anavo, that never should have happened. They basically acquired a company that had, so Anavo knew, like through the data, you could know which apps everybody had installed on their phone and how often they were using them and how much data was being sent. They had like full surveillance on a huge number of devices in developing nations. Facebook has their own surveillance machine. They didn't need to buy another surveillance machine, and then they did. And they also acquired Instagram as a surveillance machine and WhatsApp as I don't know. So I feel like this is another thing where when we start to talk about solutions to like, how do we fix Facebook? There is no fixing it. Like it's got to go. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it there, but thank you all so much for wonderful conversation. We will continue this conversation in the same bat time, same bat channel on the 28th. We have Tyler Hauer of the Philosophy Department and Colin Campbell of the Business School. And then on the 4th, same time, same Zoom, we have Orly Lobel of the law school and David McGowan of the law school, who will be talking about some of these legal issues as well. What we hope to do is continue this conversation in the spring and maybe do some in-person events at the Humanities Center. But I just want to thank everyone again for a wonderful conversation. I think that there's a lot that we can do here, and I want to keep going. I also want to recommend that everyone go from here to another Zoom meeting out of the Humanities Center featuring Robin Mitchell, who is talking about her book, Venus Noir, on colonialism. And so I'm going to try to catch that, and I wanted to give that one a plug. So thank you all, and it's been a terrific afternoon.